Good afternoon, everyone. Esmeralda Esquedon, the Associate Deputy Director of CGSR. Thank you for joining us today for our research roundtable, which is entitled War in Ukraine and its Deterrence Implications. Seeing that we have almost 300 attendees, we decided to extend it from 60 minutes to 90 minutes, but feel free to drop off at the hour mark if needed. As you all know, on February 21st, Russia invaded Ukraine, launching the largest ground war in Europe since World War II. After being met with resistance from the Ukrainian forces and intense Western pressure in the form of financial sanctions and increased military aid to Ukraine, Russia has put its nuclear forces on high alert. While the war in Ukraine brings up many complex topics that we can discuss, today we will be focusing on questions around deterrence along with the risk of nuclear conflict. To address these topics, we have three CGSR experts with us today. So first we have Brad Roberts, the Director of CGSR, Mike Albertson, the Deputy Director, and Jacek Durkalec, a Senior Fellow at CGSR. They'll each have 10 minutes to speak, and then we'll have a question and answer session. So first up is Brad.
Thanks, Esmeralda. Thanks for serving the duties of host today, and thanks to all of you for your interest in joining us. This is, as you know, an impromptu gathering. We just decided over the weekend that this would be something important we should do for our community. So we're prepared to share some preliminary thinking on all of this and leave plenty of time for discussion and take it in any direction people would like. I'd like to make three main arguments or address three main questions. The first is how do we make sense of the big grab? By the big grab, I mean President Putin seemed poised to gain everything he said he was after without a full military action against the state of Ukraine. He seemed to be able to put in place frozen conflicts in the two contested territories, to put an end to the discussion of Ukraine joining NATO, and to demonstrate his resolve to defend Russian interests. But he's gone for much more, obviously. And how do we make sense of this? Well, in the debate of the last few days, there are three main answers. One is this is a case of miscalculation and overreach, driven largely by emotion and somebody fading in old age. The second argument is that he's fulfilling the vision of a new Russia that is connected to his vision of the old Russia going back 1,000 or more years. And the third is that this is one campaign in a larger war, broadly defined, and what he's doing in his significant military activities and political activities around Ukraine is setting the conditions for success in the next phase or phases of his ongoing war. My view is that of these three explanations, these three propositions, the third is the most plausible. Most of us took little notice of a 10-page document that was leaked to the Russian media by the Russian government. This was Russia's response to America's response to the Russian draft treaty for security guarantees in Europe that Russia put on the table in December. In 10 pages, this document says repeatedly there are something is unacceptable, 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 unacceptable. The Americans, to quote, the American side did not give us a constructive response to the basic elements of the draft treaty that we prepared. We are talking about the rejection of further expansion of NATO, the withdrawal of the Bucharest formula that Ukraine will become a member of NATO, the rejection of the creation of military bases on the territories of states that were previously part of the USSR, as well as the return of military potential, including strike and NATO infrastructure to the state of 1997. These provisions are of fundamental importance to Russia. In the absence of firm, legally binding guarantees, Russia will be forced to respond, including through the implementation of military technical measures. This is about a lot more than Ukraine. This is about, quote, the elimination of the infrastructure for the rapid deployment of nuclear weapons in Europe, as well as the cessation of NATO training and exercises and handling of these weapons, which involve non-nuclear NATO states as well. Without removing this nuclear irritant, discussion of the topic of non-strategic nuclear weapons is impossible. I don't mean to suggest this is all about nuclear weapons. This is all about President Putin's commitment stated over a decade ago to snap back hard, quote unquote, against a European security order he considered dangerous because it was about encirclement and containment of Russia. And I think he wishes that his legacy will be a new European order in which America has largely retreated over the horizon, and there's a buffer zone next to Russia of largely deferential states. So what explains the big grab, setting the conditions for success in this longer campaign? Second key question, did an erosion of deterrence contribute to this current circumstance? Well, in my view, it's a factor, but not the central factor. You know, the argument is often made that President Putin decided to do this because of the poor American performance in Afghanistan. I think that misses the 10, 15-year history of lead up to this. This is not simply, quote, opportunistic aggression, as it's sometimes called. He's been getting ready for this problem, for this activity militarily and otherwise, for at least a dozen years. But let's acknowledge the facts that there's been no significant NATO response to the changing Russian way of war, except at the conventional level in the Baltic region. There's been no significant NATO response to Russian modernization of its theater strike capabilities and its aerospace strategies. And there's been no significant NATO response to new threats to NATO in the nuclear and other new domains. And I believe that this has reinforced Putin's calculation that the alliance would be unwilling to defend its interests, and that this will bear on our thinking about the next stage of his campaign. So the third question is, what is that next stage? Well, recall what the document said. Military technical measures to return NATO infrastructure, including strike capabilities, to 1997. This is what he said. And I believe other actions to demonstrate that the North Atlantic Treaty and its core commitments has come to seen as not relevant in the 21st century. And the question in front of us is, how might this stage unfold and when? It seems to me that if Russia finds itself in a military quagmire and a very long-term pacification project in Ukraine, it's going to be absorbed there and not have the military and political resources to engage in other kinds of pressure campaigns against the West. But if it's relatively brutal, even more brutal in the next immediate future and succeeds in the pacification of Ukraine, then it could be sooner rather than later that we see new pressure against the NATO alliance and its members. The alliance might have time to adjust its deterrence and defense posture to accommodate this new reality. It might not. This may play out in weeks and months, not years. But if it plays out in years, the alliance has the opportunity to finish some old business with regard to sprucing up its deterrent, but also to pursue some new business. The new business would be new and different capabilities and new and different places. But the old business is already abundant, incomplete. NATO, every summit of NATO leaders, heads of state and government, has made a commitment to broaden nuclear sharing and strengthen the nuclear deterrent posture of the alliance. there are no substantial exercises of NATO's nuclear forces. Russia maintains the Zapad exercise program, which provides for the integrated exercising of nuclear and non-nuclear capabilities. NATO has no such activity. NATO is an alliance that doesn't conduct nuclear planning against any country. It is its principal advisory body, the long-term vision, the 2030 Commission, strongly encouraged the alliance to revitalize its nuclear deterrent. There have been no steps taken in follow-up. So there's a lot here that the alliance could do with the tools available to it to strengthen its deterrence posture, while it also asks the question, what more can be done by other means? So one final thought, a little off my list of topics, but is um, one of the questions we've all been discussing is, so what about China, and how's China watching all of this, and what lessons might it yet draw? And I think one must be that China's concept for success in the Taiwan contingency is very much a concept built around shock and awe and creating a fait accompli quickly, presenting the United States with the image of a large cost to be paid if it tries to reverse the fait accompli. And what we've seen here so far is the latest demonstration of the fact that shock and awe doesn't work very well, especially against countries with large urban centers. And if shock and awe doesn't result from big military activities, then modern war is the old business of old war, of going in and slogging into cities and killing people in large numbers, which unfortunately may be what we're about to see in Ukraine. With that, Esmeret, back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Brad. Those are great points. Next on the list is Mike Albertson.
So hi, everybody. Mike Albertson. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the conventional deterrence picture, what we're seeing, why this is different from 2014 in Ukraine, what's possibly coming next, and some takeaways. A lot of good analysis is being done out there. There's a lot of smart people to read out there. I would point out in particular for sort of non-experts the work that Michael Kaufman and Jeff Edmonds are doing at CNA. They're sort of good resources, and they have some nice threads on Twitter about sort of what they're seeing, what they're thinking as this crisis unfolds. So remember back to 2014, to put all this into context. You had mass demonstrations in Ukraine. You had a failed crackdown by the Ukrainian government. The Russian-leaning Ukrainian president flees the country in late February, and you have this sort of political vacuum and chaos, which led to sort of two distinct phases in what you saw unfold conventionally over the next year. One was Russia seizing on the chaos to take Crimea back in March 2014. They had a big naval base there. They had a lot of military personnel already there. It was seen as a very Russian-leaning, Russian-speaking region. And they executed a quick special forces operation, right, that coined the term Little Green Men. You know, very fast, very quick, some degree of deniability in a very confused information space, a very confused political space. Seized the peninsula, declared victory, declared incorporation into Russia, all done very, very quickly. Then you had sort of more a muddle unfold over the rest of the year in eastern Ukraine, with a gradual build-up towards conventional warfare. You had at the beginning sort of local separatist groups that were supported covertly by the Russian government, which gradually needed to get bolstered by mercenaries coming in from Russia, that gradually then need to get bolstered by Russian military units coming in unmarked, that gradually then needed to get supported by air defense and artillery capabilities supported from inside of Russian territory. And Ukrainian military units were getting caught in open territory in eastern Ukraine and getting ground up as they tried to take on the separatists, which led to sort of the ceasefire, the Minsk Accords, a stalemate, and then periodic alarms of escalation. Also, since 2014, you've seen the Russian military operate in Syria, and people have drawn a lot of conclusions from that. with a small set of sort of hand-picked Russian forces, capability demonstrations of new precision strike equipment, but all done in sort of a largely permissive environment with the support of the host government. And obviously what we've seen over the past week in Ukraine has been very different, right? You had a massive conventional buildup on the border with Ukraine with a big question of sort of what was going to happen, right? What was Putin going to do? What was the military operation to look like? How would the West respond? And most of the Russia experts out there were skeptical that Putin would go with a large-scale invasion. It didn't make a lot of sense. There wasn't a clear sense of what political goals it would achieve. If the Russian military was going to go in, people expected maybe it would be a quick fait accompli, some sort of salami slicing to carve out more territory and split Western resolve in the Donbass. On the other hand, you had the Russian military capability experts out there that were of the opinion that you don't deploy this much equipment for this long from all over Russia for no reason, and that if Russia chose to invade, and the probability of this was high, they argued, you were going to see a full display of all of the operational art that Russia had developed over the last decade. You were going to have nodal targeting by precision weapons, quick air superiority, air defense suppression, combined ground, air, naval, airborne operations with cyber mixed in, information operations, electronic warfare, sort of the whole kit and caboodle of Russian capabilities on display. And then you had battalion tactical groups that were these sort of special or modular units that were created to operate independently, that were going to fan out along multiple axes and sort of overwhelm Ukraine quickly. And the idea was that the general staff had 8 years of planning and training to get this right. So what has happened over the last week? Something that I think surprised all of the experts. Most of the Russian experts were surprised, first of all, that there was a large-scale invasion, and I think the Russian military capability experts who were validated in thinking this was going to happen were surprised in how this was done. So you had a large-scale conventional invasion, but one that was done really haphazardly and ineptly. And everyone is now trying to unpack why this happens. You had airborne air assault forces getting sent into units that were still heavily defended and getting chewed up. You had long exposed Russian convoys strung out along roads that were getting chewed up. You were having little units getting way out ahead of everybody else and getting picked off piecemeal. You had tanks unsupported by infantry. The Ukrainians still had armed UAVs up and operating over Russian units. You were having Russian forces getting taken prisoner, and sort of just general uncoordination. And as this is all being unpacked by the experts, what you're starting to see sort of gel is this idea that there was a combination of very bad political assumptions made, that you could go in and take Kyiv relatively cheaply and quickly, that this, once done, would sort of lead to a collapse of the Ukrainian government and hence the Ukrainian military. And that because of these bad political assumptions, you had bad military execution that was shaped by these political assumptions, coupled with an excessive focus on secrecy that led troops to not knowing sort of where they were going, what they were doing, where they even were on a map, and then a sort of a visible lack of morale and will to fight that's evident in the film you're seeing about sort of abandoned equipment, Russian troops milling around in towns or on the sides of roads with sort of no idea what to do or where to go. So the last few days have been very bad for the Russian military. If the casualty numbers that are out there to be believed, Russia's lost more men in the last several days than they did in the entire 94 to 96 First Chechen War, which was seen as the nadir of the Russian general purpose forces. They've completely lost the information campaign. And they're now sending in more troops to support what everyone, I think, agrees is sort of a failed political set of assumptions. So a lot of deficiencies have been exposed for the world to see. Old equipment, or continued reliance on conscripts, some corruption in the defense support services, bad logistics, and sort of bad general staff planning and execution on something they should have gotten right. At the same time, Russia still has an enormous conventional numerical superiority. They haven't committed all their forces, particularly all their sort of air forces and naval strike forces. They've taken a lot of territory. They're starting to surround some of the larger cities. You're starting to see the Russians use a lot more artillery and missile strikes, more cyber, more information warfare. And like Brad said, we're entering a new, more dangerous, more brutal phase of urban warfare, conventional operations with the Russian military could win, right? And I put win in air quotes because at the end of the day, the question is now whether sort of winning the conventional war actually achieves the Russian political objectives that Brad set out in his remarks. You know, nuclear posturing doesn't help you in dealing with this concrete problem in warfare about taking cities that don't want to be taken. You go back to Clausewitz, right? War is an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. They expected to be greeted as liberators, right? After a quick operation. And now they're finding out to liberate a city, they have to destroy it and kill a lot of Ukrainian civilians in the process and get filmed doing it. And staring them in the face is what Ambassador Taylor mentioned in a CGSR talk a month ago, is that Ukraine is a fundamentally different and far more anti-Russian country than it was 8 years ago. So some takeaways for the group here at the lab. One, the takeaway that combined arms warfare and joint warfare is hard. It's hard to combine ground operations and air operations, or artillery supporting armor supporting infantry. Multi-domain warfare, right, using separate domains simultaneously is harder. Integrated warfare, integrated deterrence is going to be even harder than that. So it's nice to have combined multi-domain integrated deterrence as an aspirational goal, but it's a reminder that papers, articles, doctrine, scripted training is very different than trying to pull off the real thing in a contested and complex environment when a political, roll of the dice is at stake. The second big takeaway, I think, is that the human element is very important. You could have built a model, you could have applied political science theory, and a lot of people did, to say the costs outweigh the benefits here, Putin's not going to invade. And you would have been wrong. You could have built a simulation pitting Russian and Ukrainian forces against one another and said run, and it would have probably told you this will be over relatively quickly. And that's also would have been wrong. Clausewitz again cautioned against, a kind of war by algebra, right? You can see a lot of human elements here that people didn't take into account. Putin's decision to invade, the people around Putin who informed and planned and executed his decision are now getting yelled at, to the common soldiers who were on the ground. And you think of some conscript from the Russian Far East who spent 2 weeks on a train to get all the way across the country, who's been living in a tent in Belarus for the last 2 weeks in the cold, and who's now in the middle of Ukraine with no idea what he's doing there. And you can see that sort of the human element is critical to all of this. And the third takeaway I just note is sort of intellectual humility. You've seen some very wild swings in thinking over the last few days, from the Russian military is amazing to the Russian military is garbage. Putin is a genius to Putin's living in a fantasy world. The information space is really confusing right now. It's going to take a while to unpack all of this. So, question assumptions, beware certainty from experts, try to avoid these wild pendulum swings in thinking. I just say in closing that we've seen some really, really seismic changes over the last week. And I will have a hard time categorically saying, something won't happen, because I've seen more changes in the last week than I've seen in 2 decades. And I think this question of, this won't happen, this can't happen is a nice segue into Jacek's comments on the nuclear dimension. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was great. Next, we are going to turn to Jacek Durkalec. He's a senior fellow with CGSR. And after that, we'll move over to the Q&A session. Jacek?
Thank you, Esmeralda, and thank you, Brad and Mike for introduction, because I think that in my presentation I will sort of try to complement what you said by focusing on the nuclear aspect. And I think it is clear to all of us, or many of us, that what we currently see in Ukraine has a nuclear dimension. So Russia's aggressive actions are nuclear backed, and I would argue that this is neither something new nor unexpected, and this is because we should remember that Russia has already used its nuclear arsenal to back its aggressive actions against Ukraine in 2014, 2015, and it was actually the topic of my first lecture at CGSR back in 2015, and my paper on nuclear-backed little green man. And To better understand what we have seen so far and what may be in front of us, I think it's good to have it in a perspective, and because of that, I find it useful to look at similarities and differences between Russia's nuclear-related words and deeds nowadays, these days, and 8 years ago. So in my input to our discussion, I will briefly discuss the following questions. What are differences in the context of Russia's nuclear messaging if we compare 2014-15 to 2022? How is Russia's nuclear signaling different? Are the United States and its NATO allies better prepared to respond to Russia's nuclear threat? And briefly what are the implications? Let me start by highlighting that the context of Russia's nuclear saber rattling is radically different now than it was 8 years ago, and because of the different context, there are many more pathways to nuclear escalation, and this escalation seems more realistic. And this is for the three main reasons. First, Russia's nuclear messages accompany an open aggression and war atrocities committed by Russia against Ukraine. And in contrast, in 2014-15, so like back in 2014-15, Russia was hiding behind the little green man or separatists, and this is not the case anymore. Also, in contrast to 2014-15, the war is more heavily engaged in conflict. Western sanctions against Russia are unprecedented and amount to some extent to an economic war against Russia. West also openly provides arms to Ukraine, and the only self-imposed Western limitation is a direct engagement in fight with Russia. And the second reason why the risks of escalation now is higher than it was 8 years ago is because Putin seems to be unhinged. Attack on Ukraine demonstrated that he's prone to risk, miscalculation, and doesn't much care about his international reputation. And Putin's goals are also much more ambitious than they were in 2014-15. So it's not only about the parts of Ukraine, but it's about the most of the Ukraine, if not the entire Ukraine, and about, as Brad said, reordering European security architecture. And the third reason why the context is different and more worrisome today is that in the eyes of Putin, over the last decade, the nuclear balance shifted to Russia's favor. So, like for many years, Putin and other Russia's officials were bragging about the progress that Russia made in making strategic forces modernized. So Putin himself seems to think that hypersonic weapons, for some reasons, give him some edge. And also, currently, Russia has much more options for regional nuclear strike than it had in 2014. So the context is different, but what about Russia's nuclear-related actions? And this brings me to my second point. So how the Russia's nuclear messages that we have seen so far compared to what Russia did in 2014-2015. And what hasn't changed is that Russia uses a wide array of tools, so including aggressive rhetoric, exercises, and operations, and also Russia's steps are intended to deter Western intervention and show discontent, affect Russia's response to Russia's actions. And we have to remember that in 2014-2015, Russia's nuclear signals accompanied sort of Russia's escalatory steps on the ground, but also Western decisions about the sanctions. And still there are some notable differences, at least what I have observed so far. So first, of course, in 2022, so now Russia's nuclear threats are explicit, so they are not veiled as in 2014-15, and the reason is that Russia is a direct part of the conflict, so Russia took its gloves off, so it doesn't have to play with subtlety and deniability as it was 8 years ago. So, for example, last Sunday, Putin explicitly announced placing the country's deterrence forces on high combat alert. Previously, Putin acknowledged that Russia that he was ready to put the nuclear forces or on alert during the annexation of Crimea, but he sort of admitted it a year after the fact. Second, this time Russia has used more explicitly used nuclear threats to prepare conditions for success in war against Ukraine before the war even started, and there was no time for such preparation in 2014. So if we look at Russia's large-scale strategic exercises, they took place on February 19. And preceded the conventional actions, and during these exercises, Putin tested entire nuclear triad and all sort of non-strategic missile systems. On February 7, during press conference with President Macron, Putin threatened that if NATO would be pulled in a conflict with Russia, NATO, beginning of quote, won't even have time to blink an eye when execute Article 5, end of quote, and announcing the war on February 24, Putin threatened that in the case of Western interference, beginning of quote, Russia will respond immediately, and the consequences will be such as you have never seen in your entire history, and all the necessary decisions in this regard have been taken. And next sort of a difference is that there seems to be sort of new elements of messaging. So in particular, 222 overflights over Belarus and the change of Belarusian constitution that allows to deploy the weapons of Belarusian territory. But I would say that it's more a change of a geographical change than a change in substance, because back in 2014-15, Russia's official underscored that the sort of a right to deploy nuclear weapons in Crimea. And what we should also keep in mind that based on what Russia did 8 years ago, Russia has still a sort of a plenty of options to sort of a further for further sort of a nuclear messaging. So strategic bombers, overflights close to the US territory, nuclear snub exercises, or visible exercises of non-strategic nuclear weapons. And this brings me to my next point. So what about US NATO response? So back in 2014, 2015, the US and NATO allies were surprised and unprepared on how to react to Russia's nuclear messaging. And since then, they had like eight years to prepare. And I would argue that like some important lessons have been learned. So first, the French, US, UK, and officials and NATO Secretary General response to Russia's messaging about the alert status was prompt and deliberate. And second, and even more importantly, the US strategic bombers were deployed in Europe before the war even started. And I think this reduced the need for hasty reactions in response to Russia's statements or actions. Saying this, there were, however, shortcomings in the Western reactions. I still think that despite the NATO since 2016 stepped its nuclear rhetoric, NATO doesn't or hasn't done much, hasn't done enough to prepare European public for a nuclear crisis. I'm also not convinced that we did what was enough over the last 8 years to convince Putin about the Western collective resolve to counter nuclear intimidation. And my hope is that the furious Western response to Russia aggression, so political and economic response, will sort of decrease the chance of Putin miscalculation, that he would think twice before he does something. And this brings me to my last and brief points about implications. So based on Western response so far to Russia aggression, I think it's hard to me imagine that Russia's actions would not have long-term nuclear policy and posture sort of implications. And my hope is that sort of what Russia is doing will help to eliminate some existing barriers to further nuclear adaptation along the lines which Brad mentioned. But primarily, I think that what we should focus on are the short-term implications of what we are seeing. So first, the risk of Putin's nuclear use should be taken seriously, and I think there is a need to ensure and do whatever we can to convince him that to sort of not miscalculate what the response will be. So he must be convinced that as someone said, that even though threatening nuclear weapons might cost him nothing, actually using them would cost him everything. And second, I think that we should prepare for intensification of Russia's nuclear messaging and direct threats. So what we have seen so far, I'm afraid, is just the beginning. And third, Russian nuclear threats shouldn't intimidate us from providing the necessary support to Ukraine. So we should do everything what we can short of direct military engagement. But I think this is something what we also have to take into account. Even this seems inconceivable right now, that our stake in a conflict in Ukraine, I mean the Western stake, might sort of change and grow over time, and we should take this into account. And I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.